And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm Ferran, and along with Kit, we seek to take our listeners on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible unto the growth of the body. This is the 53rd episode in our journey through the scripture series. We're really excited about where we are too as we get ready to transition into the New Testament shortly. But one of the key features that we really want to make sure we unpack is the significance of the threshold of a renewed kingdom, which is John the Baptist and his role within salvation history. And so with that context and framing in mind, Kit, let's go ahead and jump in. Kit, one of the things I think our listeners and our watchers may be wondering is, how do the opening chapters of Genesis, which if our listeners are curious, we spent a lot of time unpacking about a year ago as we actually kicked off our podcast, but how do the opening chapters of Genesis establish God's purpose for creation as sacred space, and how does humanity's fall create the need for a human agent to restore that purpose? And maybe spend a little time just refreshing our listeners on what we mean by sacred space as well, Kit.
When we talk about sacred space, we're talking about, in a sense, where God's space and the creation's space come together. In other words, maybe most specifically, the place where God is present in the world, a holy place or a sanctified place. When we think of sacred space, we tend to think of like a temple or the Holy of Holies, that sort of thing in terms of the scripture. But more broadly, sacred space refers to this connectedness between God and his creation. So it's not just simply where God is, but it's more how he is in relation to his creation.
Right.
And we've talked at length about how the creation account is presenting, and this is the way the ancient Israelites would have viewed it. What is being depicted in the creation account is God constructing a place in his creation for him to dwell that has human beings at the center. We talked about how in the ancient world, when you would build a temple, the last thing that would be done is an image of the deity associated with that temple. An image of the deity would be fashioned and set in the midst of that temple or sanctuary, and that image became a tangible physical interface between the deity and the worshiper. And that's what's really being depicted in Genesis 1 and 2. God is ordering and filling a creation that he intends to inhabit, and he creates man as his image and likeness so that man will be the interface between God and his creation in a very real way, the way in which and the one in which God will actually be physically present and interactive, operative in his creation. So that's what sacred space is about. And we've seen, even as we've dealt with the first 3 chapters of Genesis, and we keep going back there all through the whole story, again, as we've emphasized over and over again, we tend as people to read the Bible in a bifurcated, isolated, broken, fragmented sort of way. Okay, I'm reading this passage today, and now I read this passage tomorrow. And we tend to miss the organic, progressive wholeness of the scriptures. We've used even that idea of painting a picture, painting a painting. And each brushstroke is individual, but it goes on to the painting based on what's already there, and it adds to it. So every brushstroke on the painting presupposes what precedes it and then also contributes to what's there with a view to the finished painting. And everywhere you are in the Old Testament scriptures, this is what's happening. It's the telling of a story towards the goal that God would accomplish what he intends. And so we see God's intent in kind of a germinal way expressed in the creation account. God's intent to fill his creation with his own presence, to rule over his creation, but with man at the center. Man is that image and likeness who is to be priest and king, administering God's lordship, also bearing back to God the relationship of the creation with him. Man is that mediator as well. So this is what God's intent for the creation is. And this is the way we need to interpret even the fall account and what really came about. And we've talked about how essentially the outcome of this thing called the fall is exile. If God's creating a world that he wants to be present in, intimately present in, administering his own relationship with it through man, his image bearer, then the breaking of that relationship through the fall, first between God and man, and then between God and his creation, because of man standing at the center, and that broken relationship impacts God's relationship with the creation, we end up with this situation of exile, which again is relational estrangement and alienation. And the text shows that by God expelling the man and the woman from the garden, not having access back to it, the garden symbolizing God's dwelling place. Man is expelled from the presence of God and cut off from the life of God. This becomes the fundamental human and creational problem that now God has purposed and pledged to restore. And the whole rest of the Old Testament history is the working out of that intent to undo this creational exile, this alienation and death and estrangement, and ultimately to realize, to accomplish what he depicted in the initial creation account. So that's what's happening. And even as we're, as you said, coming to the threshold of the New Testament and the birth of Jesus, we have to understand the birth of Jesus and even this role of John the Baptist as the forerunner, as it were, through the lens of, again, what is God doing? What has God been saying? And Jesus will say this, the scriptures are testifying of me. What scriptures? Israel's scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures. So if we don't interpret the person and the work of Jesus through the lens of this intent of God that we've been discussing, then we really don't even understand what he came to accomplish or what he did actually accomplish or what it means for us.
Building on that first question, speak a little bit more to in what way does Israel's covenant story, which we've talked about at length, which is rooted in Abraham, developed in Sinai covenant, right, embodied in David's kingship, to all those things are intricately and inextricably tied together. How do all those components reveal both God's design for sacred space and Israel's failure to fulfill its vocation, right? Thinking about that functional reality which we live into.
We've talked before also about the fact that if you ask people what's the basic scheme of the scriptures, they will tend to say, okay, creation, fall, Jesus, and salvation, redemption, whatever, and then consummation, new creation, whatever, new heavens, new earth. And typically people leave out that critical piece that you just mentioned, which is the Israel piece. And why is that important? Because as we've seen, and this is why we've so painstakingly walked through the Old Testament story, this problem that arises in Eden that God reveals he's determined to remedy, he chooses a man, Abraham. Abraham is to be the instrument for solving the problem of human exile and creational exile. So Abraham is the one through whom all the families of the earth are to be blessed. That covenant that God makes with Abraham is passed to his son and his grandson. And then Jacob, the grandson, becomes the man Israel, out of whom come 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. So Israel then becomes the Abrahamic people who, through that same covenant relationship and covenant obligation, are to be the light of the nations. They are to be the people, the Abrahamic people, through whom God will accomplish this purpose to restore all things back to himself. So the Old Testament history is predominantly the history of the people of Israel, but just not as, okay, here's an ethnic people and God chose them and whatever, he's doing this, he's doing that. And eventually, okay, Jesus is born and he's a Jew. Isn't that great? It's much more than that. As we're going to see, even as we consider this moving into this threshold and the coming of John the Baptist. So Israel's story, and it is a covenant story, they are the Abrahamic people. It is absolutely vital because if God's intent, to put it in that, as we began, if God's intent is to restore and perfect sacred space, his own relationship with his creation, that intent by his own design has the Abrahamic people, Israel as the Abrahamic people, at the very center of that. And so Israel's failure to fulfill its covenant identity, its covenant election, its covenant calling on behalf of the world, in a very real way, brings this project of recovering and perfecting sacred space, it brings that into jeopardy. If Israel can't be Israel, then God's purpose for the world that's bound up in Israel as the Abrahamic people cannot go forward. And so how is God going to resolve this problem? And this is, again, as we've seen, one of the great points of tension in the Old Testament scriptures is that God has bound up the whole future of his creation in Abraham and his descendants. But Abraham's descendants cannot fulfill that calling. So what's going to happen? How is God going to resolve the problem? And that's why Israel's so central to this.
Just to stamp something that I really want to make sure that we've talked about at length the last couple of weeks too, is when we say that salvation history is a uniquely Israelite story, what we're not saying is in terms of geography or ethnicity. What we are saying is conceptually, right? Functionally, in terms of how God is working through this idea of Israel, to your point, to accomplish and address this creational exile and estrangement too. I just wanted to stamp that because so often I think to many of our listeners, when they hear Israel, they're thinking about a lot of the things and the stories we see on Fox News or CNN
Right.
or a lot of these
Right.
outlets and media channels. Just, Kid, would you mind just stamping that one more time in your own way, too, before we move on to the next question? I just think it's imperative that when people hear Israel, that they are porting that through the right lens. Can you speak to that just a little bit more, Kid?
Sure. And I appreciate that because that is crucially important, particularly in the times in which we live, because like you said, we hear Israel and we think, okay, this nation state
Right.
over in the Middle East. We hear Israel and we think, okay, these Jewish people who happen to live in that nation state. And biblically, neither one of those things really speak to what Israel is about. As we've said, Israel isn't an ethnicity, it's not an ethnic people, it's not a place, it's not a nation state. Biblically, Israel is a covenantal and theological concept. And by that, what we mean is that Israel is the Abrahamic people for the sake of the work, the vocation, the purpose that God bound up in Abraham. As I said, Israel first is the man, Jacob. Abraham has a son, Isaac. Isaac has a son, Jacob. Jacob becomes Israel. He is Israel. He is that covenant descendant of Abraham for the sake of God's purposes for all the world. So this Abrahamic election and vocation for the sake of undoing the curse, as it were, the Abrahamic people, or this extension of Abraham and a corporate people, that's for the sake of God's purposes for the world. Jacob is that, and then he has 12 sons who become the 12 tribes of Israel. And all of the Israel history of that people that we see in the Old Testament has to be understood through that lens. And again, as we've said also several times, this is how Paul can say things like, Paul in the New Testament, not all Israel is Israel. How can that be if it's an ethnicity? He recognizes the fact that, again, within this people, Israel, you had some who were faithful to the calling, but for the most part, the nation, meaning this 12 tribes of Israel, they were unfaithful to their Abrahamic identity, their Abrahamic election for the sake of the world. And so even though ethnically, genealogically, they were descended from Abraham, they were not really of Abraham. They were not really Abraham's descendants in the covenantal way, and therefore they were really not Israel. And part of what we see, even as we'll start considering, again, this preparation leading into John the Baptist, is that God promises to, and we've talked about this, raise up from within Israel, the Abrahamic people, an Israelite, a servant Israel, who will be what the collective people were not. He will intend to restore or cause Israel to be Israel through a servant he will raise up from within Israel. So if we don't understand Israel in this covenantal theological context, if we think of it as a nation state or an ethnicity or something, then we're going to confuse what's happening in the Middle East with those people there and that nation state with what we read in the Old Testament. And that's obviously a very significant problem in our generation.
Plus one. I couldn't have said it any better, Kit. Thanks for circling back and stamping that once again. Kit, building on what we just talked about the last several minutes, how did Israel's exile intensify the crisis of sacred space and yet set the stage for Yahweh's renewed commitment to fulfill his covenant promises and purposes through a future priest king from David's line? Speak to that a little bit.
Again, what we have as the fundamental principle is that from Genesis 3 forward, God's intent is to end the creation's exile that has human beings at the center of that. And so Israel, the Abrahamic people, are the people chosen by God for that purpose. But as we've seen, as we've traced their own history, they're continually dealing with issues of their own exile, geographically, relationally. And all of that finally comes to a head when both of the two kingdoms of Israel, after they divided, end up being conquered, hauled away into exile, subjugated under Gentile powers. And by the time Judah is destroyed in 586 BC, there is nothing left of the Abrahamic household and that covenant kingdom that had been reached its climax under David. So in a very real way, if we can put it this way, the people that God had marked out to be the instrument for ending the creation's exile, human exile, are now themselves utterly given over to exile. They are gone. They are away. And again, it's not just physical. God has left them. And even when they come back and rebuild the temple and rebuild the city, Yahweh doesn't return. He promises he will. But this fundamental exile is still in place. And Orthodox rabbis to this very day will say Israel is still in exile. They're waiting for the Messiah to come to renew the covenant and restore the covenant relationship through forgiveness and covenant renewal. So the people who were to end the creation's exile are themselves given over to exile. That means that this promise, this hope of sacred space, God being intimately related to his creation, sacred space is the antithesis of exile, if we can put it that way. That goal of God seems unattainable because the people who were to be his instrument to secure that are themselves utterly given over to this exile that seems to be, again, unresolvable.
Consider how the promised forerunner announced in Isaiah and embodied by John the Baptist was a crucial indicator that Yahweh himself was returning to end Israel's exile and inaugurate his long-awaited kingdom. Speak to that a little bit. I think there are so many misconceptions and misunderstandings about not only John's significance, just even about his purpose in Scripture, Kit, too, but how he actually performs a very intentional bridge as a forerunner in terms of knitting this story together in a very cohesive fashion. Talk to that a little bit too, because I know this is going to be critical as we transition into the New Testament.
At the very least, I think that anyone who reads the Bible, anyone who engages with it, and certainly Christians, it should stand out as a first observance when you turn to the New Testament. All four of the gospel writers begin their accounts with John the Baptist. He's at the beginning of their accounts. All four of them deal with the person and the ministry of John the Baptist. That should tell us that they viewed him as a critical figure in in their own presentation of, interpretation of, and understanding of the person and the work of Jesus the Messiah. So that should tell us, that alone should tell us that John is very important in understanding who Jesus is. And they show him, all of them show him to be, as you said, this forerunner figure. This takes us back to Isaiah's prophecy. And again, just to step back from that, both houses of Israel, the northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, they're marked out at the time of Isaiah, they're both marked out for ultimate desolation, destruction, exile, which means the breaking of the relationship between God and the Abrahamic people. And Yahweh himself departs. He leaves his sanctuary. The sanctuary is torn to the ground. He's gone. But this section in Isaiah, then beginning with chapter 40, which introduces the last focus section in Isaiah that promises that God is going to solve this problem and put all things right, it begins with a message of comfort. It says to Zion, it says to Jerusalem that she's to be comforted because her warfare, her conflict, all of these things that have been the plight of the Israelite people because of their unfaithfulness, God is going to restore that. And what he's going to do is he's going to send a herald, a messenger, often translated as a forerunner, but it's a person that he will send ahead of himself to the alienated, scattered, exiled people of Israel to announce to them that Yahweh is now going to return. And he's going to return, obviously, to put things right in that relationship. What caused him to depart? Covenant unfaithfulness, breaking the covenant, spiritual adultery, Israel as an unfaithful son, all of that. For God to return and once again take his place in the midst of his people, he's got to resolve the problem of relational alienation. There's going to be forgiveness of sin, covenant renewal, and once again, he'll take his place in his sanctuary in the midst of his people. And so this message of comfort and consolation that begins Isaiah 40, that's in the mouth of this herald, this messenger who will come, it's to announce that Yahweh is returning to do that, to put all things right. And this becomes the Old Testament's presentation of this idea of gospel. You know, how blessed on the mountain are the feet of him who brings good news, who announces peace, who says to Zion, your God reigns. Yahweh is coming back to finally establish the kingdom he's been promising, to regather his people, to cleanse them, to forgive them, to renew the covenant relationship, to see his own sanctuary restored. Once again, he takes his place in the midst of his people. He restores sacred space. And this forerunner individual in Isaiah's prophecy is someone who will come to announce that, but also work as a person who prepares the people to receive that. In the ancient world, again, we've talked about this, a king or a dignitary or whatever would often send someone ahead of him to announce that he was coming for a visit or for whatever. And the subjects or the people who were to be the audience for that dignitary, this man who would go ahead and prepare, he would get them ready to receive this one who is coming to them, whether it was to go out and meet him or whatever. But he would go and tell them, hey, this guy is coming, and we need to get ready for you to receive him when he arrives. And so this is what this forerunner idea is all about. And what the gospel writers show us is that John the Baptizer is that individual.
Indeed.
So that's the way we have to understand his ministration.
Indeed. Kid, as we close this episode, one question that I think is really a capstone and really knits a lot of the topics, a lot of the ideas we've already discussed is, how does Isaiah's servant songs reveal the identity and mission, going back to the idea of function, of the coming servant, both faithful Israel and suffering deliverer, whose obedience, suffering, and triumph restore Israel, renew creation, and fulfill God's plan to flood the earth with his presence through a global family, which actually takes us back to creation itself and the very intention that God had. So
Right.
we've come full circle. So yeah.
The servant songs are very important. Once again, these are within Isaiah's prophecy. And we talked about how that last section, chapter 40 through 66 of Isaiah, begins with this proclamation of comfort and consolation. Yahweh's returning. He's going to put all things right, and how that is to be the message announced by this forerunner. That section then also contains, chapter 40 through 66, also contains these servant songs. 4 of them, chapter 42, 49, chapter 50, and then the end of 52 and through 53. And many Christians are familiar with Isaiah 53, the suffering servant passage. That's the 4th of the 4 servant songs. They're poems that set out and depict and exalt this particular servant. What's important about that? The text first makes it clear that Israel is the servant. Servant in what sense? Israel is the servant of Yahweh's purpose for the world. Israel is to be the light of the nation. So Israel's identity and vocation role are associated with these ideas of son, disciple, servant, and witness. And in all of those ways, Israel had failed. And so in the midst of God talking about Israel is my servant, but Israel is a failed servant, Israel is a failed disciple, Israel is an unfaithful son, Israel has not witnessed of me to the nations. They have testified against me by aligning themselves with the nations. They've chased after other gods. They've forsaken me. And in the midst of that condemnation of Israel, the servant, God begins to talk about another servant, one he will put his spirit upon him, one who will bring justice, one who will lead the nations back to him, one who will be a faithful disciple, who has the ear of a disciple, who has the tongue of a disciple, who will be a faithful witness. These servant songs depict this individual in that way, but they also depict him. And again, there are 4 of them, and there's a progress in the way this works out. And I won't go into a lot of depth with it. But this one who will be faithful where Israel has been unfaithful, the result of that faithfulness will not be the wider Israel, the wider Abrahamic people embracing him and rejoicing in him and saying, this is the one in whom we find the truth of who we ought to be. And isn't that great? And let's embrace him and let's follow him. That faithfulness on his part to be anointed of the Spirit and faithful disciple, servant, witness, son of God for the sake of the world. When they observe that, or the way this dynamic will play out is that this will bring opposition and persecution upon him. He will be one in whom the nation will react negatively. They will oppose him. And so that last servant song of Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, he's depicted as the one who bears Israel's affliction. He bears Israel's sickness, Israel's disease. He bears Israel's stripes. He bears Israel's judgment, again, for the sake that he would be Israel in whom God would restore Israel, the Abrahamic people, and ultimately such that he would embody the covenant to take God's deliverance, his redemption, his renewal to all the ends of the earth, which once again gets us back to Abraham and that Abrahamic vocation. So this is, again, Isaiah 42, and then in 49, and then in chapter 50, and it's not the whole of the chapters, but people can Google servant songs and they can see where these passages are and go and read them. But the servant songs are critically important to understanding, again, how God is going to cause Israel to be Israel, to fulfill its role on behalf of the world. And that whole section of this servant, son, disciple, witness that God's going to raise up from within Israel is, in a sense, prefixed by this coming messenger. And so when John is introduced, John the Baptist is introduced as this forerunner, what that should have told the people of Israel who knew their scriptures is that this messianic servant must now be at hand. This is the time when Yahweh's returning to Zion, and we'll talk more about that. But that's how the servant songs are critical, the critical kind of, in a sense, wider framework for understanding this forerunner that Isaiah promised and how that promised figure now is realized. He has his actual existence in time and space in this person, John the Baptist.
We sincerely hope this time you've shared with us has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode, where we wrap up part 2 of the Threshold of a Renewed Kingdom. For Kit, I'm Ferran, and we'll see you down the road.